right, this is our first snippet for progressivism and constitutional history. And the theme of this snippet is the emergence of the court and and judicial decisions as a whole as a controversial issue and this sort of grassroots reform effort. So the best known decision from this Supreme Court decision from this period is a case called Lochner versus New York. It was filed by this bakery, Lochner's Bakery, from New York State, which challenged a New York state law that limited the number of hours per week that bakers could work to 60 hours per week. So this is a very, very rudimentary health and safety measure. And the argument that the bakery made was that, look, these, that this is an inappropriate restriction on our right to, to have our employees work as long as we want. And in the court's decision in Lochner, it held that the liberty of contract relating to labor includes both parties to it. The one has as much right to purchase as the other right to sell, as the other to sell labor. So the court's argument was that this restriction, saying that bakery workers couldn't work for more than 60 hours per week, inappropriately harmed. It denied due process to those workers who wanted to work for more than 60 hours a week and were prohibited to do so. This is something of a stretch of an argument. And there's a strong dissent from Justice Holmes, former Harvard professor, a figure of some, sort of the typical progressive jurist, who says that this is simply an absurd decision. It's perverted definition of liberty according to the court. The theory laid down in Lochner was a theory called substantive due process, which, as defined, often gave the court authority to strike down laws, critics argued anyway, with which the majority of justices simply disagreed ideologically on the grounds that it shocked the conscience of the court. But Lochner is precedent, and Lochner basically says that the court is going to look very, very, very skeptically on statutes that limit work week or provide other seeming benefits to workers on grounds of health and safety. But there is one decision from the early 20th century where the court does uphold a work week restriction law. It's a case out of Oregon. The case is called Mueller versus Oregon. The Oregon law is very similar to the New York law, with one critical exception. The Oregon law was confined to women. It said that there was a maximum work week just for women, and the thinking behind this was, at least in part, an argument that if businesses had to limit the number of hours they gave to women, this would create a kind of general maximal work week, because otherwise creating shifts and things like that would be too difficult. What makes the Mueller case interesting is that the labor groups who back the law, which is being challenged, turn to the most prominent consumer lawyer in the country at the time, a man who will later join the Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis. And Brandeis prepares a brief called an Amicus Brief. That is a brief that is not the brief of the parties, but the brief of someone who is allied with one of the parties, that is providing information beyond the scope of what was in the parties' briefs. And the so-called Brandeis Brief brings in social science arguments suggesting that women are physiologically weaker than men, and therefore there's a special justification for protecting them through state legislation. So there's an irony here, which is that this is a labor law being defended by labor unions, with Louis Brandeis, one of the most prominent, liberals of the day, making these, seemingly misogynistic arguments. But they appeal to the court, and in Mueller versus Oregon, the court upholds the Oregon law on grounds that women have a special burden, and that the state has to has to protect them for the future well-being of the race. Mueller is no longer good law, but it's a reminder of the tactical choices that people often make when they consider the Supreme Court. The era of court decisions becoming controversial in the progressive period, which is basically U.S. history from 1900 to 1920, and we can argue when progressivism begins and ends, peaks in 1912 when Theodore Roosevelt, who was president from 1901 to 1909, decides that he wants to run for a third non-consecutive term. He attempts to win the Republican nomination, unseating his selected successor, a man named William Howard Taft. Taft, although he understands he will not be able to defeat Roosevelt if Roosevelt runs as a third-party candidate, Taft declines to stand aside, in large part because Taft, the joke is that Taft is the only person who ever saw the presidency as a stepping stone to higher office, and in this case, it was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Taft was a legalist. He's very alarmed at one aspect of the Roosevelt political platform in 2012. Excuse me, in 1912, which called for modifying the principle of judicial review. And I have the section that I bolded here in red as the key Roosevelt proposal. And what Roosevelt is saying is that in cases involving the police power, for instance, a case like Lochner, where the court declares the law unconstitutional, that there should be some way of challenging a court decision, maybe through a popular referendum, maybe through a congressional action. For Taft, this is anathema because it suggests that the Supreme Court is not the final voice on the Constitution. And the fact that it's coming from Roosevelt, not an ultra radical, suggests how controversial the court had become. One other thing I think about that's important about progressivism during this period is that there's a lot of action at the state level during this period by progressives seeking to change the structure of state government to achieve reform. Robert La Follette, Wisconsin governor and then senator, strong advocate of regulation as a way of overseeing big business, and also making the case that the way to achieve reform is through an informed electorate. He publishes this thing called La Follette's Magazine, which was a weekly magazine, which does the path-breaking thing for the first decade of the 20th century, of printing roll call votes, House and Senate roll call votes, as a way of educating the public in various states as to how their representatives or senators were actually voting. In California, Hiram Johnson, governor and then later senator from California, and state progressives pushed through a new state constitution, which changes the structure of the government. It creates two kinds of popular votes: the initiative and the referendum, a system in which the people can bypass the legislature and vote on their own. And it creates a system of recall where you have a statewide official who maybe is not doing their job, at least in the idea of the public, and that person can be recalled if a fixed number of people sign a ballot petition, and will have to stand for election again. There's currently a recall measure. Some of you might have seen this from the news against the California governor, Gavin Newsom. The thinking behind the initiative and the referendum, the Johnson approach, is that the state legislature in California was controlled by business interests, by lobbyists, and the way to get reform legislation passed is to allow the people to back it. And after the new constitution is adopted, you see all of these various state initiatives or referenda designed to deal with a whole bunch of different sorts of issues: taxation, the death penalty, bonds for various issues, voting by mail. Again, this is 1914, a kind of modern concept. This system, it sounded great on paper. It's been just a disaster in practice for the current current California ballots, page after page after page of all these very complex initiatives and referenda. But the thinking here is you change the structure of government that makes it more responsive to the people. And a final example of this comes in the effort to change the Constitution. Two key figures here on the left is a guy named George Norris, who was a Republican senator from Nebraska. On the right, Joseph Bristow, who was a Republican senator from Kansas. This is a period in American history in which the states of the upper Midwest were basically one-party Republican states. And so the battle within the ideological battle within the states often was in the Republican primary. So even though both Norris and Bristow were Republicans, they were actually very liberal. I mean, today they would be very, very liberal Democrats. And they pushed the idea of changing the structure of the government to create a more meaningful reform rate. Two amendments result from this: the 16th Amendment, which reverses a previous Supreme Court decision and allows for a direct income tax from the federal government, and the 17th Amendment allowing for direct election of senators, which Norris and Bristow believe will create a more responsive and frankly a more liberal, well, that's their goal here, Senate. So this idea of changing the structure of government, either the state governments through things like the initiative and referenda, or the federal government through constitutional amendments, this is very much a hallmark of progressive era approach to constitutional developments.